Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our inaugural Countdown to COP26 webinar. This will be the first in a series of monthly webinars from July to November, where we'll be discussing CCS climate technology, COP26, and the path to net zero. We have an insightful program for you today, where we'll be discussing CCS in the international climate negotiations. My name is Tamme. I'm a senior climate policy advisor with the Institute, and I will be moderating the discussion today. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, the Global CCS Institute is an international think tank whose mission is to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture and storage, a vital technology to tackle climate change and deliver climate neutrality. Now, when we move on to the next slides, I'd like to highlight that during today's session, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function on the Zoom control panel that you see at the bottom of your screen. And in the coming days, a recording of this webinar will be made available at the Institute's website. Today's webinar will include a panel of climate experts who themselves have been involved in the international climate negotiations for a long time. And so we are very excited to hear their insights. And if we move on to the next slides, before we delve into the panel discussion, joining us is John Scowcroft, a consultant with the Institute who focuses on international climate negotiations. Having been to every COP since the very first conference in Berlin in 1995, he's here to share a bit of a background about climate negotiations and CCS. So, John, over to you.
Thank you, Eva. Hello, everyone. As Eva said, I want to give you a bit of a background to the discussion, particularly as regards the then bit of the webinar. It is, after all, just 50 years since construction started on the first commercial CCS plant in Terrell, Texas, and it's nearly 24 years since the KP recognized CCS technologies in Article 3. Looking at that journey from my own experience, I remember that at the beginning of this century, the European power industry, having decided that emissions trading was its preferred vehicle to deliver emissions reductions, then turned its attention as to how those reductions would come about. The discussion ranged over nuclear, hydro, clean coal, gas, maybe renewables. Don't forget this was 20 years ago. And what about CCS, someone said. Oh, that's 30 years away, was the reply. But we better find out about it. And we actually spent some considerable time researching CCS in the early part of this century. But I digress. CCS in the convention KP, well, its first formal outing came at the 22nd meeting of the CDM Executive Board in November 2005. A methodology had been submitted, but the board could not agree on the general issue of CCS in the CDM and requested guidance from the COP-MOP as to whether CCS projects could be considered as CDM project activities. Between then and 2008, the issue was considered at 2 CMPs and 4 subster meetings, which resulted in 2 workshops and a large range of submissions from parties, NGOs, etc. During that period, there were a couple of interventions from business NGOs. In 2006, a self-titled ad hoc group, which comprised representatives from the ICC, IETA, IPECA, EEI, and Eurelectric, recommended to the COP-MOP that it established an international working group with assistance from, and I quote, appropriate international organizations to resolve the issues relating to CCS by COP13 in 2007. Indeed, at the 2007 Bali COP, the same group put on a side event with speakers from the IEA, IPCC Working Group 3, the European Commission, and Petrobras, who described their Brazilian CCS projects. I don't know whether there was anyone from the Australian delegation present, but just over a year later, the Australian government established the Global CCS Institute. So coming back to my narrative, at the COP14 in 2008 in Poznan, the CMP asked the CDM Executive Board to assess the implications of the inclusion of CCS as CDM projects. It's also worth noting that at that time, the EU was also agreeing the establishment of the NER 300. This work continued up to the Copenhagen COP in 2009, and then through to Cancun in 2010, and finally at Durban in 2011, the CMP decision adopted the modalities and procedures of CCS in geological formations as CDM project activities. I've been very rapidly over those last 3 years because most of the panelists were actually intimately involved in those discussions, and I don't want to take words out of their mouths. Now, before handing back to AV and the panel, and as I say, I apologise to them for the sketchy nature of their brief history of CCS in the CDM, as I know they lived through it. I'd like to make a couple of points on context. Why was CCS in the CDM an issue? And I'm not necessarily talking about the public acceptance issues, but a more general point. First, the IPCC special report of 2005 made the point that 220 to 2,200 gigatons of CO2 would need to be stored to achieve stabilization at 450 to 750 parts per million of CO2 by 2100. This had caught the eye of policymakers. The EU, for example, has set an ambition for 12 plants to be in operation by 2015, and the IEA reckoned that 20 plants capturing about 100 million tons a year would be needed by 2020. There are currently some 26 plants in operation. And secondly, at that time, the discussion was mainly focused on coal-fired power plants and as integrated projects, i.e. capture, transport and storage as one pipeline. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. As the IPCC 450 to 750 ppm shows, we're only really thinking, I think, in terms of a 50% reduction by mid-century. And it was clear that coal plants could provide a significant proportion of that. Indeed, one of the presentations I saw at the time suggested that 40 to 60% of the reductions required to get the 50% reduction could be achieved through CCS. The combination now of a net zero world and the massive deployment of renewables has meant that more attention now is focused on the hard to abate sectors than on the power sector. This is certainly the case in Europe. A final thought for the panel. As attention turns away from CCS in the power sector, although I hope not entirely, because there are a lot of young coal plants around the world that have got 20 to 30 years of life left, and the attention focuses more on industrial, cement, steel, and chemicals. And also the business model has moved away from the large-scale integrated model to a more disaggregated hub and cluster model. Is there anything in the modalities and procedures agreed in Durban that would need revisiting going forward? And with those few thoughts, I'll hand you back to AV, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, John, for setting the scene. Now it's the time to move on to the panel discussion. So panelists, could you please turn on the cameras and microphones? Meanwhile, I'll do a quick intro. So with us today are Ulrika Raab, a senior advisor with the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency. Paul Zakkour, director with Carbon Counts. Pedro Barata, a senior director of EU policy at the Environmental Defense Fund. And Eric Holdsworth, managing director of Clean Energy and Environmental Policy at the Edison Electric Institute. So thank you everyone for joining us. It's great to see you here. What I would suggest to kind of get over with as the very first thing before we get into the questions and so on, if that's okay with all the panelists, I would give each of you, let's say, 1 to 2 minutes to just give a bit of a quick intro, who you are and how you have, what is your relationship with the climate negotiations and CCS, just to set the scene that we know that in the next round where we really go and start exploring different questions, we already understand where you're all coming from, and then we can start, you know, picking up the questions from the others and yeah, play the game. So if that's okay, I saw already Pedro nodding very clearly. I will start with you, Pedro. So your 1 to 2 minutes intro. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Eva. So my connection with the CCS theme in the negotiations. Well, first of all, I was a climate negotiator from 1999 until 2011 or 2012. Working on the Portuguese delegation and as a member of the European Union delegations throughout those years. In 2008, I joined the CDM executive board. And so my first run-in with CCS in the CDM was as a CDM executive board member, looking at, well, prior to that, I had sat through meetings, but at that particular meeting, we were asked to respond to a request by the COP, and then for some reason I ended up chairing the contact group that John mentioned. So that was around 2008, 2009. So that's my run-in with CCS in the CDM.
Wonderful, thank you. Ulrika, let's continue with you.
Thank you, Eva, and thanks also for the introduction, John. You bring us down memory lanes. I actually had to look some things up in my CV because I don't have the same sense for years and sequences as you have. But as Pedro, I was once upon a time a climate negotiator for Sweden. Started as that in 2001 and continued now up until 2018. But I have recently transitioned from the climate area into ozone. So that's my current job. I work on ozone depleting substances and protection of the ozone layer at the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency. I was negotiating for Sweden and also for the European Union in Nairobi and also in Copenhagen. I have very vague memories of Copenhagen negotiations. It was mostly in contact groups on CCS. What happened in the big arena, I didn't see much of. We were very, very busy. And I was also co-chairing the contact group on a couple of instances, 2012, and I was the technical expert meetings chair in 2014. So I've been in contact with this area for quite some time, and it's quite interesting to reflect on then versus now. And I'm sure we'll get ample time to get back to that, but I think that's long enough from me.
Thank you, and indeed, we'll definitely get back to the question of then and now. Let's move on to Paul. Would you please do a quick intro?
Hello, everybody. I'm Paul Zakkour. I'm a director here at Carbon Counts, which is a consulting firm. But my relationship to this topic stretches back to 15 or 16 years monitoring the whole process early on in the early efforts to develop methodological concepts, particularly around defining the boundaries, leakage and permanence, which were the early topics that were the main concerns about CCS. And I guess it's important in those respects to mention that you know, a lot of work went in over the period 2005 to around about 2011, 12 and beyond to understand what we mean by boundaries for CCS projects, how leakage could be managed, but primarily actually permanence was the key area where so much progress was made in terms of what the modalities and procedures set out. And I think it's also important to note, as John framed it, what needs to be revisited. You know, we put a lot of effort in, a lot of governments put a lot of effort in. It wasn't just us, because what we did, we took a lot of ideas and information that came from a lot of sources from US, Canada, Norway, EU. There was probably 100+ submissions made by different parties on this topic over that period, outlining ideas for how these issues could be effectively managed. And what our job was to bring all of those together in a package that that looked consistent, that met parties' expectations about what these projects could and couldn't do on the ground. And all that was embodied through the negotiating process into the rule book. So, and that rule book does line up quite tidily with the rule book that we see coming into the Paris Agreement in respect of the transparency framework and the requirements therein. So we are on a good platform to move forward with CCS in some of these arenas, but there are still some questions that need to be resolved, and I guess we can come back to those in a minute. But just to note that there was a lot of work done, and let's perhaps avoid opening all that back up again for discussion.
That is noted.
All the documents, it's all on the UNFCCC website.
Thank you, Paul. And Eric, please share from your side.
Thanks, Evie, and join the other panelists in thanking you and GCCSI for the invitation to participate today, and to Jean for our trip down memory lane and the yellow brick road. Yes, as Ulrika said, fond memories of many nights spent in UV lit rooms. I'm Eric Holdsworth. I'm with the Edison Electric Institute. We represent electric companies in the United States. I've been involved with the Framework Convention process pretty much since its beginning. And you just can imagine representing US power companies, particularly in the early days when coal was 50% or more of our power generation. I think to Paul's comments, obviously a lot of our members were thinking of CCS as an opportunity to reduce emissions from coal and be able to make our impact in this process. And so sort of reading the EEI delegation of these meetings, had a chance to be intimately involved in those discussions. As John noted, we participated in the ad hoc group, several of those side events. We put on our own side events. And I think even more importantly, and this goes to Paul's last point about a lot of the work that was being done on the private sector side, several of our members were involved in very early stage CCS demonstration projects, attempting to utilizing their own plants and capital to try to prove up and demonstrate that CCS could be an effective tool. Unfortunately, those projects did not end in a positive way, not from a technology standpoint, but more from a policy standpoint. And I think, as we've just been talking here, the intersection policy is equally as important as the technology development in order to deploy this. So I've had a chance to see this evolve and intimately involved in the earlier periods. And now we see, I think, more promise for CCS. And I really look forward to getting back to the conversation. Obviously, we're still very focused on CCS in the US for power production and not just for hard to abate sectors, particularly given the growing role of natural gas in our generation, and look forward to our conversation thinking about coal and fossil fuel use around the globe as we try to bring electricity to the billion or so people that still lack it to help improve their standards of living. So really look forward to today's conversation.
Thanks. Excellent. So we have heard from all of you, and we also heard from John at his intro. So the way I suggest that we go about it is I have some questions prepared from my side that I'm very, very eager to ask and hear your thoughts on. And meanwhile, as I mentioned already in my introduction, all the participants who have tuned in, please add your questions as you think of them in the Q&A box, because I'll be also monitoring that, and if something specific that is relevant for the discussion as it's evolving comes up, I will try to feed those live live questions also into our conversation to make the most of it. And so because there's now several of us, and we'll like kind of need to figure out, who will be the first to speak and when. I'll be very flexible. I see all of you, so you can either use, so the panelists, you can either use the raise hand function on Zoom, or you can just kind of wave or in any way kind of indicate that you want to pick something up, and like I'll hand over to you. With that said, I think several of you have already mentioned this, comparison between then and now and what it actually means. What I'd like to start out with is getting your take on what can we learn from the negotiations in the late 2000s and bring forward to today when we are discussing the implementation of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. What is it, because all of you have followed it for, it's amazing to have all of you here discussing and sharing, but I'm sure you have many ideas. So is there anyone who already wants to volunteer? Otherwise, I will just call someone. Ulrika is just smiling so much. Ulrika, I'll start with you. So what's...
Thank you.
and then I'll move over to Pedro.
I'm just enjoying being on this panel. It's a very interesting topic, and I've been trying to, in preparation for this panel, also think back and what negotiations were like. And it was a very big issue in 2005 because that was the IPCC special report on CCS that came out. And at that time, we still needed to sort out collectively what we meant by CCS, that we mainly talked about geological storage. It was a lot of knowledge, capacity building that took place, that we learned as negotiators what this technology was all about, and also what possible role it could play in the climate change agreement. And it was something that Norway had done domestically and put it in their national reporting. But then a lot of the negotiations were focused around CCS and CDM, which I would say it's kind of a special case because CDM was, it was climate projects in developing countries. And of course, that's one niche application. But a lot of the discussions and the concerns at that time were centered around the integrity of the storage, which also Paul mentioned, also who takes the long-term responsibility, and also in the context that developing countries under the Kyoto Protocol didn't really have the same reporting and accounting framework that developed countries had. The Paris Agreement, of course, is very different because all the countries have a lot of reporting requirements and an accounting framework that is more comprehensive. So that's a difference. But I think one of the fears in the late 2000, I don't know, when around Copenhagen 2009, say, was that by promoting or advocating CCS, you would get a lot of enhanced oil recovery. And it's of course, it's just one application of it. But I think those who were against it or opposed it in those days were actually quite often having that view because of the fears that you would promote continued fossil use, and you would actually enhanced oil recovery would be more profitable by having this revenue stream from the climate service that carbon capture and storage could do. And I think that's a completely different mindset from the one we have today, where the IPCC scenarios shows that this is something that's quite core, and it's necessary in quite a lot of the scenarios. It comes in full scale. It comes in for reaching net zero. So it's much more needed. That's the perception, but it's also much more focused on bio CCS. And of course, the infrastructure is pretty much similar or the same, but the focus is primarily on bio CCS and how you can reach net zero. So that's a big difference I've actually picked up on. I don't know exactly what lessons we should extract from that, but at least it means that we are not exactly in the same situation last time when we discussed this intensively. There are differences.
Yeah, it's a different era indeed. Pedro, you were ready to share your insights. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Eva. So lessons. There are many lessons on a personal level. Some of them include being ready to sit through, I think, 48 hours straight of negotiations, and so have a lot of protein, etc. But on a more serious note, I think Ulrika already said much of what I wanted to say. We are in a different situation right now, because at the time, so casting my mind back to 2008, 2009, 2010, we're looking at at CCS in the CDM discussion. So the first thing to note was the CDM already had a substantial amount of controversy despite CCS. So that's the first thing, is you're trying to set CCS into a mechanism that already had enormous issues and enormous criticism with regards to additionality, et cetera, which could be picked up upon for criticism to the specificity of including CCS. I.e., the argument was, why bother with CCS in the CDM, given that the CDM by itself already has so many other issues? So that would be the first big difference. The other difference is, obviously, as Ulrika mentioned, we're now in a situation where there's a much broader recognition of the fact that if we want to get to net zero by 2050, broadly speaking, we would need a substantial amount of removals. And so some kind of carbon capture and storage, whether it's geological, well, anyway, some kind of removal solution will be required. And the reality is that we have some experience with the technology of CCS, and it has been there for a while. So that would be, as a starter, some of the differences. I think we now have a different situation where what we could do, or hopefully not we, as in I don't expect to be part of this new wave, but our successors might want to do, is to pick up on the good work that was done in the context of the subsidy back then, the decision that was made, the Durban decision, and to adapt it to the new regime, i.e. Article 6.4, where there's an explicit mandate to actually go back to the CDM and look at what was done, but also to screen it for its usefulness in the current context, and to remind ourselves that, unlike the previous very much top-down approach to all of the market mechanisms, we're now in a situation where not just 6.4 is there, but 6.2, which is a much more bottom-up development type, where you can actually look at plugging into that wealth of resources from all of these workshops and the decisions, etc., and fashion something from that into a 6.4 compliant market mechanism. So that would be, I think, the key relevance, not just for Article 6.4, but for Article 6.2. More broadly, I think we did some extraordinary work that could be picked upon by national and regional organizations in figuring out how to deal with so many of the technical issues of CCS. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. So there's a lot to learn from and a huge amount of work done. I mean, I keep hearing that message, right? And you were all there and you knew, very clearly how it was to get it done and what's actually there. Eric, I saw you being ready to share your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to, just a quick thought on this. I really appreciate Pedro and Ulrika's comments. To me, one of the takeaways too, I mean, as John noted in his introduction, in 2009, we were still trying to sort out what role, if any, CCS might be playing in the CDM. And we were, into commitment periods. And, to me, a critical lesson is not only what happened in the late 2000s, is what happened in the late 90s through the late 2000s. And, there was a whole push for the CDM to only have certain technologies recognized. It took a long time to broaden that. And to me, a critical lesson out of all of that was like, we have just got to use and be willing to use every tool in the toolbox to address this challenge. And the more we want to limit the tools that we're going to use, the harder it's going to be, the more expensive it's going to be, and the longer it's going to take. And, you know, a lot of us, I mean, I don't know how much you could have gotten done on CCS to the CDM in that time period, but I really feel like we retarded a lot of efforts by spending so long and trying to even assess whether we were willing to do it, and do we need to do pilot projects. And all I know is a pilot phase is like the death knell of any technology in the Framework Convention, because it never gets to come out of that. So I just think for me, yeah, looking forward to Article 6 and the Paris Agreement, and being able to utilize a wide range of market mechanisms and tools. My advice is like, let's be a little less fearful of every particular technology and what it might do, and figure out more like, can these be helpful, and how can we help promote their deployment? And something like CCUS, I mean, I think Ulrika's comment was really interesting to me, right? I mean, you look at the science, you look at the IPCC, you look at most of the credible analysis, CCUS critical role if we're going to address this challenge. I listen to the public debate in the US and elsewhere in this country, and it's like, why would we want CCUS? It's just going to increase the use of fossil fuels. We don't need to do that. So in some ways, I feel like the science and the analytics have now gotten ahead of the public debate, and I think it's important for us to circle back on that. But just wanted to throw in that, from my perspective, a lesson learned from that earlier process.
Thanks. And just, yeah, reacting to what you said about, you know, either in the past, this wish to choose specific technologies. It's just great that we have Article 6 that in itself is really a technology neutral approach. And this way we have, yeah, all options open. It just remains to be seen. It remains to be seen how exactly the more detailed rules will be agreed. Paul, would you like to add some thoughts from your side? You already started on this line in your intro, but anything to add before we move on to next topics? There are a lot of questions coming in. I'm already, we're like half-time mark right now, and I'm realizing we'll have issues covering all the things people want us to cover.
I think you can move on to the next topic, Eva. I think we covered.
Sure.
What can we learn already quite nicely? Yeah, for me, there's so many things to discuss that let's move the agenda.
So where I'd like to go to, and I mean, there are some questions that have come in that are also looking at this, is how can the government and industry, so both the government and industry, support the wider recognition of CCS under the Paris Agreement and in the implementation of Paris Agreements? What are your thoughts? I mean, in this new context of different net zero targets and so on, you know, we already have quite a few references here by you to that. But what could happen in your view, in addition to what is already happening? Because we are seeing that, you know, what is happening now still doesn't look to be enough if we were to be on the pathway to net zero. Pedro, over to you.
It's not exactly to your question, but a lot of the comments I see are on the cost of technology, and there's always been kind of a bane of these discussions is, again, why CCS and the CDM, given that, you know, at its height, the CDM didn't reach prices bigger than 10 euros a ton. That would never be enough to fully cover the incremental cost of CCS in any of the pilots. So, you know, why the fuss? I think there is a couple of things to be said there. One of the arguments that resonated, at least with me, was this isn't really about making sure that CCS is on a cost level playing field with other technologies, but it was much more about making sure that the CDM is and that our approach to technology is one of neutrality. So everybody recognized at the time that CCS was costly, and it's still costly, and more costly so than let's say emission reduction opportunities under the the CDM. So that's a fair thing. What we also recognize is, and I think increasingly, is that we will get to a point where we will need some of these technologies, carbon removal technologies that are not available right now, that are not cost effective to put into the carbon market, even at, in the European context, even at 50 euros a ton. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't, first of all, try to address them and put them and standardize them and address them in legislation to cover a lot of the technical and legal gaps that we had back then, and some of which, and Paul here would certainly know more about that than myself, which are still there. So the first thing I would say is cost is not the issue. The issue is the recognition of the technology. And then, of course, there are ways of incentivizing CCS that could have a market component, i.e. a carbon price into it, but should always be supplemented, at least in an initial phase, with other types of instruments. So there has to be a little bit more ingenuity than just simply saying, oh, the carbon price doesn't get it, therefore, let's not think about it, basically.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's really, it's a question that I've been getting a lot. What should be the carbon price to make CCS happen? And it's really, there's much more to it than just having a carbon price. And you're absolutely right with that. Ulrika.
Yes, thank you, Eve. I also had a quick look at some of the questions in the Q&A, and I won't promise to answer them, but some of the questions that resounded with me was also this one about cost. But I would say a difference between before and now is that now if we look at the IPCC scenarios, what's truly needed to reach the targets we have set ourselves, the EU has Fit for 55, Sweden has a neutrality target or a net zero target for 2045. We are looking at things that will transform society. We are looking at something that will bring on an industrial revolution of sorts. And then the cost span is not just about finding the least cost options, because we will have to explore many options and not all of them will be cheap. Some of them will be very expensive. And I think when it comes to CCS or bio-CCS, which is the aspect discussed in Sweden, you have to recognize that there is no income stream from the bio-CCS part. It's something that is only demanded because of climate change. So the full cost will somehow to be covered for that to take place, because there is no other revenue stream. If you produce a product in a more environmentally friendly way, you might still sell the product and that will bring you revenue to your company. If you also do bio-CCS, that's a full out cost. And the investment support, if you look at the European Union, for instance, will cover the incremental cost, perhaps up to 60%, but that means there is still a gap for this to happen, to take place. And I think that's actually a role for governments to play also. If we want this to happen, we will have to find out schemes that pay for this climate service that we want to achieve. And in Sweden, we've been looking at reversed auctioning schemes, for instance, and costs cited are between 80 and 140 euros a ton. That's a lot of money, but damage of climate change is also quite costly. So from a societal point of view, that also needs to be taken into the balance. We are in a tight spot right now, and we will need to look at several options. Not all of them will be least cost, some of them will be costly. And for CCS, it's also the question, you can't ramp it up incrementally with some other technologies like wind power. You could start on a small scale and you could build it up gradually. With bio-CCS, it will quite often require large scale projects at once. So that's another aspect that's quite different, that also governments need to think about. But a lot of this will probably be discussed more on the national or regional level, like the European Union, and not necessarily at climate change summits, COP26, with all the countries at once. But it also will be discussions that are held on regional level or national level. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Paul, What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the questions are raising lots of interesting topics for us to think about. I guess, I mean, Pedro sort of spoke about this, and Ulrika. I think what we learned from the last 20 years is we can create nice regulatory frameworks for CCS, and we can put the policies and etc. in place, but what we can't do is deliver projects yet, and that's what we seem to be failing to do without taking a huge pile of cash and just continually throwing it at projects. I mean, I think when we look at the projects that have been deployed, it cost an enormous amount of money. So I think what we're still struggling with is the commercial proposition. How do you overcome all the commercial hurdles? And these get even more complicated when you start looking at the next round of technologies, not just CCS power plant to store, but also direct air capture coming into the equation, carbon utilization, possibly in a network and system. And so these are all new commercial challenges that everyone's getting ahead of ourselves on when we haven't solved the first of a kind commercial challenges in reality. And I think, you know, we've been doing some work with a few other people on trying to come up with a supplementary layer of support for CCS that can complement carbon pricing and work in parallel, but also give incentives to different actors in the chain. And that we're continuing to do quite a bit of work in that area with various institutions at the minute. So we hope to put more shape on those concepts sooner. But I mean, you know, for example, you know, Ulrika's talking about BECCS in Sweden, but as I understand it, the plan there is to ship the CO2 round to Norway and put it in the Northern Lights project, which is already collecting CO2 from a waste incinerator. And there's other people maybe want to put CO2 into that site as well. I mean, as the operator and developer and operator of Northern Lights faces real commercial challenges. How does it price CO2 from bio plants in Norway versus waste plants in Norway versus bio plants in Sweden versus direct air capture that could be located on top of the site? How does it structure a package that makes that economically viable, but also incentivizes that operator to really optimize that? Because you have to understand what's the interest of an operator to put CO2 in the ground that he's just accruing liability for over the long term, unless that is also sorted out. So all of those important commercial questions, I think, in the second generation under Paris Agreement, if we can find ways of solving those a little bit more neatly, I think we'll be, and moving beyond simply, oh, we need a carbon price and we need a carbon price of X, Y, or Z, or whatever that amount is, but we need a carbon price, plus we need the right set of commercial incentives for people to actually do these projects across a chain of operations. And I think that's where my thinking has been heading in the last few years. And yeah, I think that's be good if policymakers can also think about that too.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think really, really good points on commercialization, and also thanks for sharing the specific examples. I think it helps to kind of show to the audience in more detail, you know, what are the questions that are currently being discussed. But coming back to this question about government and industry support and CCS and the price agreements, we also had one question that was specifically about the work currently ongoing in the US, the infrastructure legislation and its potential impact on COP talks. So Eric, you're the representative from that side of the pond. Anything you want to add based on the comments so far, and maybe you can tackle that questions that we got that was specific to the US as well.
I'll be happy to, and try to keep it brief. I know we're a little pressed for time. Yeah, just on the last question. Yeah, I mean, I think Pedro's point about recognition of the technology is critical. And to me, there's two other big factors for the government role: RD&D funding. I mean, I look at CCUS from a power sector perspective, and it's still too expensive. You've got to build an extra power plant to power the equipment. We've got to drive those costs down. And then the other critical challenge is the permanence issue, the legal responsibility. And we've been talking about that for over a decade in our country, and no one really wants to seem to address it. And I think that's going to be a critical issue in the long run for applying it at least to power plants. And we do see a lot of opportunities for that globally and certainly within our country. And maybe as that relates to the question, I mean, certainly, right, the infrastructure bill, at least whichever one you want to talk about, bipartisan or reconciliation, there's a lot of talk, and who knows what will end up and where. But certainly we know that Senator Manchin introduced legislation that should be in the bipartisan bill that includes significant funding for CCUS along with hydrogen and long duration storage. And I think that's pretty critical, certainly for our sector, right? While we've reduced our coal use quite significantly, there's a lot of gas on the system, and we clearly see an important role for CCUS and natural gas in the way going forward for the U.S. to meet its Paris Agreement commitments, its NDC of net zero by 2050. So I think it's pretty critical. We're very focused at EEI, working with a whole group of NGOs on advancing these next generation technologies, CCUS, advanced nuclear, long duration storage, et cetera, hydrogen. And that's a full scale push now to find out if those technologies by the early 2030s are going to be scalable, if we're going to start to see if they're going to be commercially deployable. So it's critical to keep that RD&D effort going now and really ramp up those funding levels. And so certainly hopeful that that's going to survive the legislative process here and that we'll be able to advance it. How that relates to the COP process, I think maybe less directly. It's really, again, more tools for each country to use in their own particular sets of circumstances for meeting their net zero commitments. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Yes, indeed. I mean, when we talk about the upcoming COP26 session, and I think given that we have the community of stakeholders who are now actively engaging in the climate space has grown dramatically over the last couple of years. That we have, a wide range of government net zero targets, wide range of industry and cities and regions. They all have their targets and they want to understand them. I think they're all looking at, so what can we do? How can we influence the outcome of COP26? And I think it's good to point out that it's not necessarily that linear, that many things just have to happen in the regions or the countries. And then there's the COP process itself. Now, moving on from here, although we've covered a lot, and just like one of the questions, and I see it also has come up this time around, that tends to be in front of us when we talk about CCS is the question of permanence, and I understand that was also something that to some extent was discussed in the last rounds during the international climate negotiations. So is there, I saw Ulrika and Pedro reaction right away. Is there anything you can just quickly share to the audience to kind of give the flavor of, what the discussion was or where the challenge is? Pedro?
Yes, very, very quickly. The reason I smiled when you said something like to some extent was a concern. I think it was 90% of the concern, and not being an expert on the technology, to be honest. Even though I was chair, the role of myself as chair of a negotiation is not as an expert, but as somebody who's trying to get to consensus on these things. Mm-hmm. And very quickly, what we realized was that first of all, that there are a lot of myths around, for example, one of the questions here was about EOR. So for example, EOR being enhanced oil recovery, and there was this whole idea that somehow we would be flooded in the CDM with enhanced oil recovery projects if we just opened the gates to CCS. Never happened, probably wouldn't happen because at least that the CDM had some good disciplines on additionality that would probably prevent that. The same thing happened with permanence. For permanence, we obviously needed additional guidance on how to secure that the storage would be permanent. We had, first of all, to get rid of a lot of myths about explosions of storage facilities, etc. But we came to a conclusion that what we could do at that level was to ask from the proponents very serious plans on how to address permanence in storage. So, and Paul he probably has a fresher mind than myself on these issues. Paul can go through what the requirement was, but essentially we declared we're not going to have a universal solution for the issue of permanence. It needs to come from each of the proponents. But perhaps Paul can elaborate on that.
Well, Paul, I think you should add something at this stage, and you haven't spoken enough yet. So,
I think yeah, it's a good point Pedro raises as usual. I mean, what the actual CDM requirements created for developing countries who wanted to host CCS projects was a pretty tough regulatory standard that was at least aligned to what the IPCC guidelines will require those countries to do if they want to claim CCS in their inventory and count those actions towards their NDC targets. They're still going to have to meet IPCC guidelines as a de minimis, and those are quite stringent in themselves. And so what a lot of countries sought to do, and what makes good sense, was to ensure regulatory alignment between what developed countries were doing for CCS through national laws and regulations, and what developed countries would have to do for similar types of activities. So at least you've got that regulatory alignment, and therefore you could have exchangeable units. And those same topics will be there again under Article 6 when we start. If we want to transfer units from one country to another, we're going to still want those assurances about the quality of the regulatory framework in country A that's exporting a mitigation outcome to country B. And so a lot of those building blocks are there, and I don't think we need to relitigate them too much. But I think what developing countries will find is that they're pretty tough to meet. I mean, we've been working with one country for the last 18 months, and they want to do CCS, but they face real challenges in trying to put the right regulatory frameworks in place at a national level for whatever reason, and don't seem to be making the connection between you needing that regulatory alignment and the fact that if you want to attract foreign investment for CCS, you're going to need to align with, say, California standards if you want to sell credits into California or into other states in the US or into the EU. Article 6 isn't just going to create a panacea for CCS in different countries, but it's going to have to be accompanied by the right sort of regulatory frameworks that support those transfers and can unlock those financial flows. And I guess that's what we want to do at the end of the day. We want CCS on those low cost opportunities, not the high cost ones in the North Sea, but much lower cost ones onshore with cheap sources of CO2 that are the early opportunities that we still haven't managed to harness yet in the CCS world. So
thanks.
Yeah.
I'm mindful of the time. We are getting close to the end, so we have 5 minutes left, and I'm just thinking to squeeze in one more question and combining something that came from the audience to something I wanted to ask. And given that this is the first webinar in our COP26 series, so coming back to COP26, what do you see as the key action or agreement at the upcoming COP session that you think could significantly accelerate CCS deployment? And something I think I wanted to ask about was how has the political will changed among the countries when it comes to climate negotiations, and I think this could to some extent be interlinked, because what countries are looking to do and then what could possibly happen, and what would it look like to be helpful for CCS? I mean, Paul mentioned quite a bit already on the front of Article 6 and what elements could work there. But of course, there are other negotiation streams that could have impact as well. So if you think about it, obviously there's no easy and clear answer. You might all have your different ideas, but what comes to your mind if you think the upcoming session and the potential outcome that could actually be helpful and whether it's also linked to the potentially changed, how to say, like this political will of the countries. Who'd like to go first? I see both Eric and Pedro have their hands off, but I'm not sure, hands on, but I don't know if these are the old ones or the new ones. But I'll do a quick round. Everyone says something quickly on what they think could potentially be it. And I'll start with Pedro again.
Eric had his hand up first, but I'll be very quick. So my wish list for COP26, if anything, for CCS would be that we get a decision on Article 6 that acknowledges transition from CDM, in particular with relation to guidance on methodologies, etc., because that would be a quick start to the development of the infrastructure under Article 6 for CDM projects, and hopefully a technology neutral decision. We stop picking winners. Not that I don't, that I have particular fondness for CCS or for nuclear, etc. Actually, perhaps I don't even, but it's more the fact that I think we need everything on the table, and then if these project types survive, then excellent. If they don't, they won't on their merits.
Great. Let's go to Ulrika.
To add on to Pedro's list, of course, I think on a general level, the political will is much greater now than it has ever been before. And this is not only the political will, but also among the private sector. Companies all across are all aware of the challenge of climate change and are all looking into how they can climate proof their businesses and what it will mean for them. So I think the setting is good, but I think I would wish for a recognition of the enormity of the challenge to talk about the Paris Agreement not only as the well below to 1.5 target, but also realize what that actually means in the actions that's required for us, and for us all to get down to business and do some of those things, and not just talk about the targets and the goals, but also how to get there in more concrete steps. So I hope a bit of insight on that one would be great to have sink in at COP26. I hope that's not too modest wish, but I hope it's achievable.
We all wish. Well, hopefully, right? Eric, your last words.
Thanks, and I'd have to probably start by agreeing with everything Pedro said. To me, it's let's get a decision on Article 6 and complete the rule book. And let's make sure it's technology neutral. I mean, sometimes the COP process can be helpful, but sometimes to me, I just hope it's not harmful. And so avoiding, being able to use all technologies, I think will be critical. And then to Ulrika's point, I mean, that will be important. It's really up to countries to get out there and start doing demos and scaling this up and trying to do the RD&D necessary to drive some of the costs, at least as it relates to the power sector and to other areas, so that we can really, that's how we're going to advance this thing, scale it up, make it commercially affordable and deployable, and I think it'll start happening.
Thanks. And Paul, over to you.
Yeah, I guess my wish for COP26 is that if we get the Article 6 rule book, we don't accidentally put anything in there that affects the possibilities for having something that's slightly different for CCS, and we end up perhaps recreating the past, which we've seen doesn't really get us CCS happening, rather than creating something for the future that allows these sort of higher cost technologies that we're going to need, not maybe today to meet 1.5, but we might need them in 2030. But if we want them in 2030, we need to start building them today, because when we see the ramp up rates in the scenarios, I mean, I picked the IEA scenario because it's one that's fresh in my mind, but even if we stop producing fossil fuels this year in new sites, we're still going to need 7.6 gigatons of carbon stored in 2050. I mean, these are extraordinary numbers, and we can't just switch on 7.6 gigatons of carbon. We need to start happening today. So my fear is we might just end up creating a carbon market that looks for the lowest cost solutions, but it doesn't look beyond 2030 or 2035 or 2040, when we're going to need those high cost options coming in massive scale as well. So whilst it can be technology neutral, I think there is a role for something that's a bit more technology biased, if you like, that might help another layer on top for some of those key technologies. So it wouldn't necessarily be interrupting with the neutrality of carbon pricing, but something that countries can club around to put into CCS specifically, as an example. So let's not close the rule book on that happening in Glasgow.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. That's a great list of ideas, suggestions, all the things you shared here today. So let's move on with just a few concluding words from my side. On behalf of the Global CCS Institute, I'd like to thank our audience for being here. And of course, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for taking part today and sharing their insights. Our Countdown to COP26 series will be an ongoing series every month until November. So please head to our website for more details. And if you would like to hear and read more about CCS, you can also head to our website and check out our Global Status of CCS reports. If you're on social media, feel free to follow or interact with us at Global CCS. And if you have any additional questions, just email us directly at info@globalccs. Sorry, it was info@globalccsinstitute.com. And that's it. Thanks again for joining us, and goodbye.